Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a story that I think a lot of us think we know. But the reality is so much deeper. We're going into an analytical exploration of the 1972 Andes plane crash.
That's right. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. It's this 72-day ordeal that really just pushed human endurance to its absolute breaking point and then beyond.
Absolutely. And our mission for you today is to get a really thorough understanding of this, not just as, a survival story, but as this unique case study, a case study in operational failure, in how a society can form under pressure, and the extreme moral choices that are required when all the rules just disappear.
Exactly. Because when you really dig into the sources, the story goes so far beyond sensationalism. It becomes this rigorous look at human adaptability. We're going to be dissecting the mechanics of the crash itself, the profound psychological restructuring the survivors went through, and the cultural frameworks that they had to fall back on. Specifically, their devout Catholic faith and their rugby culture, which, ultimately allowed them to build a new society in the snow.
Okay, let's unpack that immediately, because the who of this story is, I think, just as crucial as the what. This was not a random flight of strangers.
Not at all. It was a remarkably specific, highly cohesive social unit. And that homogeneity is the key, really, to understanding everything that comes after.
So who were they?
Well, the group consisted almost entirely of the old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo. They were traveling with their family, their coaches, supporters. So you're looking at a group that was, overwhelmingly young.
Teenagers, some of them.
Many were teenagers or barely in their 20s, predominantly male, upper middle class, educated, and physically fit. In a sudden apocalyptic scenario like this, they didn't have to waste precious time building trust. They started with that infrastructure of trust already baked in.
So they were already a team. They had a structure.
They had captains, coaches, veterans, rookies, a hierarchy that came from the sport they played. And that immediately gave them a foundation for order, which you just wouldn't get in a typical chaotic passenger plane crash.
But let's talk more about the intellectual and religious foundation they shared, because that seems just as important.
It's where you move from organizational structure to, let's call it, moral fortitude. Nearly all of them were graduates or students of Stella Maris College, which was run by the Irish Catholic Order of the Christian Brothers.
And this wasn't just a standard religious education.
No, not at all. It was an education that fostered discipline, stoicism, and what historians often call a muscular form of Christianity.
A muscular form of Christianity. For listeners who might not be familiar with that term, what exactly does that mean in this context?
Well, it implies a faith that emphasizes action, physical discipline and self-reliance, over just passive piety. It's a belief system that taught them to meet suffering head-on.
Right. To use strength and mental rigor to overcome adversity.
Exactly. Viewing suffering as a test of character. And this specific intellectual rigor, combined with the bonds of a rugby team, meant they had the tools, both practical and philosophical, that they would later need to rationalize the ultimate moral decision. They were, in a way, pre-equipped for radical self-governance.
Right. They had this built-in capacity for leadership and shared hardship. You can easily imagine if this had been a plane of, say, unrelated tourists, the outcome would have been chaos.
A completely different story.
But even the most cohesive group couldn't survive the operational failure that brought them down. So let's move to the anatomy of the crash itself. The context, the plane's limitations, and that critical miscalculation. Controlled flight into terrain, or CFAT.
The initial details are just. They're almost unbearable in their irony. The flight was delayed. There was a massive storm front, which forced a 24-hour layover in Mendoza, Argentina on October 12th.
And that day was just a normal day.
Utterly trivial. The last normal day they would ever experience.
And the sources have these just heart-wrenching details that really highlight that contrast, don't they? Between the normal and the horror to come.
They do. Nando Parado, who becomes a central figure, spent time buying a tiny pair of red baby shoes for a nephew back home. His mother, who was also on the flight, was buying gifts. These mundane acts of connection, of planning for a future.
A future that wouldn't happen for many of them.
Exactly. And those items, like the red shoes Parado kept, would later become these powerful, visceral symbols of the hope they just refused to give up.
So they depart Mendoza on Friday, October 13th. It's 2:18 in the afternoon, 40 passengers, 5 crew. And they're close to the maximum weight limit, and crucially, they don't know about the severe headwinds they're about to fly into.
And the aircraft itself, the Fairchild FH-227D tail number T571, was just. It was a poor match for this specific challenge. It's a stretched version of the Fokker F-27 with Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop engines.
And while they were reliable, those engines had a specific critical vulnerability in the Andes.
Yes, and that vulnerability was altitude.
Thin air.
Precisely. Those engines struggled immensely in the thin, cold air above about 6,000 meters. That's roughly 20,000 feet. And since the highest peaks of the Andes soar way above that, the plane couldn't take the direct route over the summit. It was just physically impossible for that aircraft.
So instead of flying direct, the flight plan forced them into this laborious, indirect, U-shaped trajectory.
Correct. They had to fly south from Mendoza, find a lower mountain pass called Planchon Pass, cross the mountains at about 18,000 feet, which was already pushing the plane's operational ceiling. And only then, once they were safely over the Chilean flatlands near a city called 𝐏𝐻𝐃, were they cleared to turn north and descend into Santiago.
Which brings us directly to the point of failure, the CFIT. This isn't a mechanical failure. It's when a perfectly good plane is flown into the ground because of human error. What were they using to navigate in those clouds?
Their navigation was a mix of a standard radio system, VORRDEME, and dead reckoning. And dead reckoning, for those who don't know, is basically navigating by estimating your position based on speed, direction, and time.
It's a valid method, but
in the Andes, it is so easily derailed by one massive invisible factor: wind.
And the headwind was catastrophic.
It was likely overwhelming. Sources suggest the west winds hitting the aircraft were probably over 60 knots. This acted like a huge invisible brake, slowing their actual ground speed way more than the crew accounted for.
And the co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Legura, who was flying the plane, he was making that crucial calculation. How did he get it so wrong?
Legura made the cognitive error of trusting his clock over reality. He was trapped in heavy clouds, so he had no visual confirmation of the peaks below him.
He was flying blind.
Completely. He relied entirely on the expected time it should take to cross the mountains. And he concluded incorrectly that enough time had passed for them to have reached 𝐏𝐻𝐃. He believed they had cleared the spine of the Andes.
So based on that mistaken belief, he makes the call to Santiago Control.
Exactly. He radios Santiago, reports his position as being over 𝐏𝐻𝐃, and asks for permission to turn north and start the descent. Now here's a critical detail for you. Santiago Control had zero radar coverage in that region.
None at all.
None. They were completely dependent on what the pilot told them. So they trust the experienced pilot, and the controller grants clearance for the turn and the descent.
And this is where it gets just terrifyingly cinematic. They execute the turn, they start to descend, and then they finally break through the cloud deck.
They break out of the cloud, and they're expecting to see, the gentle green slopes of the Chilean valleys. Instead, what they saw was the immediate black granite face of a massive Andes ridge.
A ridge they were supposed to be miles past.
100 kilometers past. They had turned north while they were still inside the heart of the Central Cordillera, essentially flying directly into a wall of mountains.
The moment of realization must have been instantaneous, and then, at roughly 3:3 in the afternoon, the catastrophic destruction of the plane. What was that sequence like?
It was a rapid, violent series of tearing forces. First, the right wing struck a peak. The wing was immediately sheared clean off.
And that's critical.
It's critical because the force of that impact flung the wing backward, where it acted like a colossal blade, and it sliced the entire tail section, the empennage clean off the fuselage.
Which instantly opened the rear of the cabin.
Instantly and violently. 5 passengers and the steward, who were seated in that rear section, were just sucked out of the cabin into the void. Then the left wing hit another ridge and tore away. What was left was the fuselage, just a wingless, tailless metal tube.
A projectile.
An uncontrolled projectile. It hit a steep slope on the Glacier de las Lágrimas, the Glacier of Tears, at an estimated 350 kilometers per hour. It slid violently for over 700 meters, with the final brutal stop coming when the nose slammed into a huge snowbank.
And that sudden stop is what dictated who died instantly.
It caused a massive G-force spike, an instantaneous deceleration. The seats tore loose from the floor, slammed forward, crushing everyone in the front of the cabin. The pilot died instantly. In total, 12 people died either instantly or within just a few minutes of the impact.
The aftermath, just pure chaos, twisted metal, screams, and this immediate terrifying drop in temperature.
It was apocalyptic. The smell of jet fuel and blood, the screams. And as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, the temperature started to plummet. They were at over 3,500 meters. It was going to get dangerously cold very fast.
And this is where that demographic advantage of the rugby team immediately became apparent, specifically with two young medical students.
Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino. They were only 19 second-year medical students, and suddenly they were the highest medical authority on that mountain. They just took charge, starting triage in conditions that would challenge a seasoned surgeon.
What kind of injuries were they dealing with basically no supplies?
Life-threatening trauma, compound fractures, severe internal bleeding. Nando Parado was in a deep coma from a massive skull fracture. They thought he was dead and laid him with the others. Another young man, Enrique Platero, had his abdomen impaled by a piece of metal. A piece of his intestine was protruding.
Oh my God.
And Canessa managed to push it back in and just bind the wound with a piece of cloth.
They survived the impact, only to face the sheer terror of that first night.
Horrific. They huddled in the fuselage, trying to block the huge hole at the back with luggage and debris. But the temperature still dropped to around minus 30 degrees Celsius. That's minus 22 Fahrenheit. 5 more people died that first night.
And adding to that psychological pressure, the co-pilot, Legora, was still trapped and alive.
He was conscious, trapped in the wreckage, and in absolute agony, repeatedly begging for someone to shoot him. They refused. He died the next day, and the sources all emphasize this one poignant detail. He died still believing he had landed them safely in 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒, a misplaced belief that gave the survivors weeks of false hope about their location.
That initial trauma, though, it paved the way for these profound psychological shifts, starting with Nando Parado's recovery.
Parado was in a coma for 3 days, and paradoxically, the extreme cold probably saved him. It acted as a crude form of therapeutic hypothermia, reducing the swelling in his brain.
And he awoke to what?
He awoke to find his mother was dead. And then he spent the next 5 days nursing his sister, Susanna, who had been severely injured. She died in his arms on day 8.
That consecutive loss of his mother, then his sister.
It was the crucible for his survival. The sources say it effectively stripped him of the normal human fear of death. What was left was just this singular, cold determination to get back to his father. That one thought became the psychological fuel for the final expedition.
So the individual motivation was there, but the group needed a collective shock to truly commit to saving themselves. And that came on day 11.
It did, October 23rd. The search and rescue planes had been flying for over a week. The survivors could hear updates on their little transistor radio, and they'd occasionally see planes high overhead. But the white fuselage was just. It was perfectly camouflaged against the snow.
The white plane, invisible against the white mountain.
Yeah.
And what did they hear on the radio that day?
They heard the death blow to external hope. The search was officially called off. The authorities had decided that given the altitude, the cold, the time that had passed, no one could possibly have survived.
And that news, which should have just crushed them.
It did the opposite. It created a psychological pivot from passive waiting to active agency. One of the survivors, Gustavo Nikolic, wrote in a letter that the news created a strange cheer. The finality of being abandoned was, counterintuitively, liberating.
There's a quote from him that's key, isn't there?
Yes. Because we no longer have to wait for them. Now we must save ourselves. That single moment completely reestablished their frame of reference.
It shifted their mindset.
From an external locus of control waiting for rescue to an internal locus of control. They were now fully responsible for their own destiny, and that agency was absolutely necessary for the steps they had to take next, steps that society would never, ever sanction.
And those steps were forced by the crisis that was both biological and theological. The ultimate test.
The biological reality was inescapable. Their supplies, a few chocolate bars, some jam, wine vanished almost immediately. The caloric demand in that environment was just staggering. At that altitude, in those temperatures, you need 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to stay warm.
They were starving, literally wasting away.
Starvation was slow, painful, and it was guaranteed. The realization dawned that the only viable source of protein, the only way to fuel their bodies, was the bodies of their deceased friends, perfectly preserved in the glacial ice.
This confrontation with the ultimate taboo is what defines this story. How did they use their shared background to make this decision not just feasible, but morally acceptable?
This is where that muscular Christianity we talked about provided the scaffolding. They couldn't just act on instinct. They needed a rationalization that aligned with their faith.
And they settled on the communion metaphor.
Exactly. They reasoned that eating the flesh of the deceased was analogous to Holy Communion. They viewed the bodies of their friends not as corpses, but as having been offered up to sustain the physical life of the group, just as Christ offered his body for spiritual life.
It completely reframes the act, from cannibalism to a kind of reciprocal donation.
And to solidify this, they leaned heavily on a specific verse from the Bible, John 15:13. No man hath greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. They saw the dead as having already laid down their lives, and consuming them was a way of honoring that sacrifice.
A profound psychological mechanism, and the logistics of this, the practical side of it, was handled by a specific group to shield the others.
Yes, the Strauch cousins Adolfo, Eduardo, and Daniel Fernandez took on this immense psychological burden. They handled the preparation with as much reverence as they could, using shards of glass from the cockpit windshield to cut thin strips of muscle.
And I read that even then, it was almost impossible to consume the frozen raw meat.
It was, so they invented a process. They would lay the strips on the dark metal roof of the fuselage, using the sun to dry them out, creating a sort of jerky. It changed the texture and made it more palatable, which was crucial to overcoming the immediate horror of the act.
But the most important element, the one that legitimized it all within their new society, was what they called the social contract of the snow.
This was their collective legal and moral safety net. Every single surviving member gave explicit mutual consent for their body to be used as food if they died. It was a preemptive agreement. It transformed the action from a predatory act into a reciprocal commitment.
A new ethical framework, forged in desperation. But not everyone could accept it, even facing death.
𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒. He was physically strong, very well liked, but he had this deep moral revulsion to the act. He just couldn't bring himself to eat enough. And that refusal, combined with an infection, contributed directly to his decline and eventual death. His struggle really underscored that the moral justification, however powerful, just couldn't override every person's deeply ingrained barriers.
Just as they'd found a kind of stability, calorically and morally, the mountain struck again. The second catastrophe, the avalanche.
This was on day 17, October 29th. They were asleep inside the fuselage when a massive wall of snow broke loose from the ridge above and slammed into the wreck, instantly filling the interior.
Burying them alive. 8 people died instantly, and this event had huge sociological repercussions because of who was killed.
Absolutely critical losses. Marcelo Perez, the team captain who had been the leader, was killed. His death created a dangerous leadership vacuum. And Liliana Methel, the last surviving woman, also died. Her presence had been this vital source of comfort, and her loss shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy.
So the remaining 19 survivors were entombed for 3 days. What was that like inside?
Total darkness, crushing weight, dwindling oxygen. They used a metal pole to punch a hole through the cockpit roof just to get some air. But the emotional nadir, the lowest point, was that they were now forced to consume the remains of friends who had died right beside them just hours before. Any psychological distance they built was just gone.
Once they dug themselves out, the structure of their society changed. It became purely meritocratic, the society of the snow.
Yes. It was a brutal system based on contribution and potential. Leadership became functional. They identified Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin as the expeditionaries.
And they were given special status.
Correct. It wasn't favoritism. It was cold, calculating resource management. They were exempt from chores and given double rations of meat. Their only job was to build strength for the trek out.
While the workers handled the logistics, the Strauch cousins, Daniel Fernandez, and their biggest challenge, beyond the food, was water.
Dehydration was a constant threat. And you can't just eat snow. It lowers your core body temperature dangerously. They needed liquid water.
So they became engineers. They invented a solar water melter.
An incredible piece of ingenuity. They took aluminum sheets from the backs of the airplane seats, angled them toward the sun, and created these makeshift channels that funneled the slow drips of meltwater into bottles. It sounds simple, but it was absolutely life-saving.
They also solved other practical problems, like snow blindness.
Right. The UV radiation is intense at that altitude, so they repurposed the tinted plastic sun visors from the cockpit, cut them into strips, and sewed them onto straps to create crude but effective sunglasses.
And footwear.
Yeah.
They knew a trek was coming.
They were in street shoes. They fashioned oversized boots using foam from the seats and the leather from the seat backs to protect against the frostbite that had already crippled some of them.
But the masterpiece of their society, the thing that would carry them out, was the sleeping bag.
They knew sleeping in the open mountain air, even for a few hours, would be certain death. So they spent days painstakingly sewing this massive thermal bag. They used quilted insulation from the plane's tail section, and for thread, they used copper wire stripped from the electrical system.
It was designed for 3 men, specifically.
A thermal necessity. The bag was designed to hold 3 men pressed tightly together to trap their combined body heat. It was their single most vital piece of equipment for the final trek.
But before they committed to that walk, they had one last desperate hope of a technological rescue. They found the detached tail section.
That's right, the tail expedition. They hiked to the tail section and found luggage, comics, and, crucially, the aircraft's batteries. The hope was immediate. Power the radio, send an SOS.
But the power systems were incompatible.
A cruel twist of fate. The radio needed AC power, which the engines would have generated. The batteries produced DC power. Roy Harley, their designated engineer, tried desperately to build an inverter to convert the power.
He failed.
He failed. It was a crushing, final psychological blow. It confirmed with absolute certainty that they were totally alone. Their only way out was on foot.
And that decision to finally walk was forced by the death of 𝐏𝐿𝐴 𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒.
Numa died on December 11th, day 60. He weighed only 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. He had been a symbol of moral integrity, and his death was the definitive sign that the fuselage was a cemetery. If Numa couldn't survive there, nobody could. The time for waiting was over.
So on day 61, December 12th, the 3 expeditionaries, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin, set out. What did they take with them?
They carried the homemade sleeping bag, layers of scavenged clothing, and their life support. Supplies of human flesh packed into socks, and Parado's final symbolic act was to hand one of those little red baby shoes he'd bought in Mendoza inside the fuselage. He kept the other one. It was a promise. I will come back to make the pair complete.
The first phase of that journey was just a grueling ascent up a massive ridge.
3 brutal days. They were climbing a mountain ridge, Mount Seller, in a starving state, fighting the altitude. On the 3rd day, Parado, driven by that singular motivation, finally reached the summit, over 4,500 meters up. This was supposed to be the moment of revelation.
He gets to the top, expecting to see the green valleys of Chile.
And instead, he saw the ultimate devastation. The co-pilot's location report had been horrifically wrong. He saw a 360-degree panorama of jagged, white, snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see, an infinite horizon of mountains.
My God. The realization that what they had just climbed was just the first of many.
It was shattering. But Parado's mindset was already different. He'd lost the fear of death. He said later, "We are walking to our deaths, but I would rather die walking than waiting." They chose to keep moving forward.
But that infinite horizon presented an immediate logistical crisis. Not enough food for 3 men for that long.
The math was simple and cruel. They had to conserve rations. So Antonio Vizintin, who had just completed that grueling 3-day climb, was ordered to return to the crash site. He made the ultimate sacrifice. He gave Parado and Canessa all of his remaining food and then sledded back down the mountain.
So Parado and Canessa continued alone for another 7 days. What was that final push like?
The physical toll was just unimaginable. Dysentery, exhaustion. Canessa began to falter, and Parado literally had to physically drag him forward at times, driven by that promise to his father.
But the landscape started to change.
Slowly, yes. The snow gave way to bare rock, then scrub brush, and then the sight of ultimate, undeniable hope. They saw cows, livestock. That confirmed they had made it to the edge of the mountains, to civilization.
And the encounter itself is now the stuff of legend, December 20th and 21st.
They reached the bank of the roaring Rio Barroso. On the opposite side, they spotted a Chilean muleteer, an arriero named Sergio Catalan. The river was too loud to shout across.
So what did he do?
Catalan, seeing these 2 ragged, emaciated men, showed this basic act of human compassion. He threw them some bread, which they devoured, and promised to come back the next day.
And when he came back, he brought paper and a pencil tied to a rock.
Yes. And Parado, with a shaking hand, wrote the note that would end their 72-day isolation. It captures everything. The facts, the urgency, the vulnerability.
The sources have the full text. It reads, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. We have to get out of here fast. We have no food. We are weak. When are you going to look for us up there? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we?"
Catalan realized the magnitude of what he was holding. He mounted his horse and rode for hours to the nearest police outpost to raise the alarm, and the news just exploded across the globe. Uruguayans found alive.
So let's turn to the rescue. the world's reaction, and that critical moment after the confession.
The extraction was incredibly complex. The thin, turbulent air at that altitude made flying helicopters extremely dangerous. The Chilean Air Force sent two.
And Parado continued to be their guide.
He insisted on flying with the pilots. Because the original coordinates were so wrong, he had to guide them, using his newfound intimacy with the mountain's contours, directly to the wreckage. The pilots were just stunned that anyone was still alive.
6 survivors, including Parado and 𝐏𝐻𝐃, were rescued on December 22nd.
Right. And the remaining 8 had to spend one final night in the fuselage, but this time with medics and food. They were all airlifted out the next day, December 23rd, 72 days after the crash.
They were hospitalized, suffering from malnutrition, scurvy, but they were carrying this enormous secret.
They initially stuck to a fabricated story, saying they'd survived on herbs or cheese. But the skepticism grew pretty quickly. I mean, they had lost extreme amounts of weight. The lie fell apart when photos of human remains at the site were leaked to the press.
So they chose to own their truth. On December 28th, back at Stella Maris College, they held a press conference.
It took tremendous courage. Poncho Delgado was their spokesperson. He revealed the truth, but crucially, he framed it entirely through that theological lens they had developed on the mountain, the concept of a shared communion, of donation.
And the Catholic Church, the ultimate authority for them, how did it respond?
Well, the world's reaction was initial shock, but it quickly gave way to compassion and awe, largely because of how they framed it. And the Catholic Church officially intervened. They absolved the survivors, stating that given the extreme, in extremis nature of the situation, no sin had been committed, which provided enormous moral and spiritual relief.
Let's look at the long shadow this event cast. They were all deeply changed, feeling like they were living on borrowed time.
They were. And their subsequent careers often reflect the roles they took on the mountain. Roberto 𝐏𝐻𝐃, the young medic, became a prominent pediatric cardiologist. He sees his work saving children as a direct continuation of what he started up there. He even ran for president of Uruguay in 1994.
And Parado, the man of unwavering will.
Nando Parado became a successful businessman, a race car driver, and later a highly sought-after motivational speaker talking about the power of singular motivation and love. Gustavo Zerbino became a CEO in pharmaceuticals and president of the Uruguayan Rugby Union. They channeled their experience.
It's important to note the group of 16 remained intact for over 40 years, a testament to their bond. But mortality is now starting to break that perfect circle.
Yes, the group that survived the Andes is now facing the slow erosion of time. Javier Methel passed in 2015, José Luis Inciarte in 2023, and most recently in 2025, Álvaro Mangino and Daniel Fernandez Strauch. As of late 2025, 12 of the original 16 remain.
And let's conclude with the cultural legacy, specifically how this story has been told. We have the 1993 film Alive and the more recent Society of the Snow.
Alive, the Hollywood version, really focused on action-adventure and individual heroism. The survivors themselves often felt it lacked the spiritual depth and the reality of the collective effort.
But Society of the Snow is considered the definitive account.
It is. The 2023 film shifts the entire focus. It's narrated by Numa Tricati, the last man to die, which shifts the lens away from just the heroes and toward the victims, the ones who made survival possible. It focuses on the society they built, the visceral reality of it all. It's a testament to the group, not just the individual.
Finally, what is the status of the crash site today?
The site in the Valley of Tears is a place of pilgrimage now. The fuselage was burned in 1973 to prevent desecration. Today, a simple iron cross marks the mass grave where the 29 victims lie, a permanent, solemn memorial.
So what does this entire narrative, 72 days of starvation, invention, and moral realignment ultimately mean for us? This story absolutely transcends sensationalism.
It's a profound exploration of human limits. When stripped of every comfort and law, this group did not descend into savagery. They ascended into a higher form of cooperative altruism. They cared for the injured, they invented tools, they formalized a moral contract to ensure the collective could survive. It's a stunning display of resilience.
The ultimate takeaway is just that indomitable will to live, embodied in Parado's note, quote, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. They took control of their fate when the world had already written them off."
It forces us to ask these deep, defining questions about our own ethical boundaries. The survivors framed their survival as an act of mutual consent, of donation. So if the survival of the group depends entirely on the donation of an individual's body after death, does that extreme contract, signed in the snow, redefine the limit of human love? Or does it simply expose the absolute unavoidable limit of biological necessity? It's a complex moral puzzle to think about long after the story ends.